All right, welcome back everyone to another episode of Socializing Security. How are you doing today, Brian?
Doing well. It's a very busy summer with a lot of unfortunate action in some cases, but happy to be back with you, Milu. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. It's something that I think is on a lot of security professionals' mind all the time is what's the risk of a data breach and when's the right time to announce. In the news recently, as we record this in the summer of 2024, AT&T has been in the news because of a very massive data breach where I think they've said it's roughly 110 million people whose call records were potentially impacted in this breach. And what's a little bit wild about it is how long ago this particular incident took place. So it's been reported in July of 2024, but it most likely took place in 2022. So 2 years later after the fact, consumers are now being made aware of this particular incident. There was some regulatory reasons why that reporting was potentially delayed due to law enforcement investigations with the FBI and DOJ, just because this type of data could have impacted national security concerns. So I do believe that there was some regulatory reasoning behind why it's so delayed. But it does really beg the question of what's the right time to report a breach.
Yeah, and it's always such a weird situation. We'll talk a bit about it too, I'm sure, is that, how much do you notify to the media, to customers, to whoever? And also, how much do you, when do you do it? And it's this really weird balance of, well, we don't know much, but maybe we should let people know. And in some places that's starting to be regulated where there's definitive times where you have to at least tell the whatever agency happens to be regulating you as an industry, where you may have to disclose to them at the least. I'm assuming that's probably what happened with AT&T. In that, at that point, then decisions get made, and we'll get into it as we go along, I'm sure, because there's somewhat of a timeline to talk about there as to who you notify when, and there's a general flow to that I think we'll kind of walk through here, and we'll talk about some of the decisions and whatnot that goes along with that. So a lot of tough decisions to be made here, and my advice has always been make these decisions now, assuming you're not in the middle of a breach right now. Make it now so that when the breach does happen, which at this stage we all have to assume that it's going to happen to our company sooner or later, make sure that you've got that plan ready to go, so you don't have to make these decisions in the heat of the moment, or at least you've defined what the criteria are going to be to make that decision.
Yeah, this is one of the tabletop exercises that I absolutely agree that organizations should be thinking about who needs to be involved and how do you reach them, and making sure that the right stakeholders are in the room, because it's never a fun scenario when you're in the midst of an incident like this and then you're trying to figure out who are we supposed to pull in, how do we reach them, especially if people are on vacation, whatever it is. There are certain instances where people do need to be able to get on the phone, and this is definitely one of them. So it's one where making sure that emergency communications are well managed and tested. I think this is one I would always recommend companies start with this one first. Of, in the worst case that something happens, you've had a data breach, who would you want to be in the room, and what information do you need to figure out before you can really confidently go talk to the customers and then eventually the consumers that may have been impacted by that particular scenario.
Yep. Yeah, we recently had a water issue in town, and some of the communications got delayed just because it was over a holiday weekend and people were on vacation and they were short-staffed. And during the public commentary aspect of this update at a city council meeting, somebody made the point of, you guys have a succession plan? Essentially, everybody at some level needs to be prepared to execute on this plan, because you never know who's going to be available in the situation of an emergency. So they're probably thinking about this type of topic a lot right now. But should we maybe go ahead and jump on in and talk about kind of the first stage, kind of what happens?
Yeah, for sure. So I think in the first instance, right, something has happened. So whether that has come in through a bug report, or a customer has reported something, maybe they received something that they weren't supposed to, they saw data that they weren't supposed to. However it's coming through, whether that's engineer internally reported it, customer success identified it, customer reached out, whatever it is, that flags your incident response plan, right? That's step one of this particular scenario, and then getting the right team members involved to basically triage the incident to making sure that they can understand how quickly they need to identify that this is a high severity critical incident that does require escalation to compliance, legal, marketing. I'm trying to think of other, of course, information security ideally is already involved, but making sure that the right team members are in the room so that they can really start identifying, one, how quickly can we fix the issue, to making sure that we're not exposing additional information. That's usually the first thing of, if there's a vulnerability or a system glitch, whatever you want to call it, how quickly can you fix it to remediate the actual issue, to stop the bleeding, basically.
Yeah. And one thing that you called out there that I think is important for people to think about during this planning is there's a wide variety of places where an incident could first be noticed. So we talk a lot about indicators of compromise being our clues that something is going on. And that could come in from just about anywhere. So really what it comes down to it is the incident response plan really could start anywhere in the organization. It could be anybody. It could be somebody in accounting looking at their computer and noticing, hey, Excel's acting a little bit weird. It's doing something it shouldn't be doing. That could be the beginning of executing the incident response plan. So making sure everybody knows what the plan is. You talked about the thread of, hey, let's stem the bleeding. Let's do the triage aspect of it. At that point, you kind of start having multiple streams, because at some point, marketing and your comms team is going to have to get involved and is going to have to start notifying people. And you don't want to just call them. It's like, hey, we had an incident last night, and I know it's Saturday at 8:00 in the morning, but I need you to go send out a communication in the next 10 minutes. That ain't going to work. You're better off waking people up in the middle of the night so that they know what's going on and can help craft that message. Ideally, a lot of that's going to be set up already. So that it's just a matter of filling in forms and filling in the gaps and making sure that, hey, we have the communication plan ready. It's just a matter of tweaking it to the current scenario. Of course, there's other streams that may be going on around, helping customer service understand what's going on and what they need to say to customers if they call in. Because, we haven't reached the point at which we talk about letting customers know, because that needs to be something that people within the organization, again, everybody needs to understand what the plan is going to be so that they don't leak that information out inappropriately. I know in organizations I've been in, there's a very well-defined group of people that are allowed to communicate these types of things. And we all kind of know that. They go through training, so they know how to deal with the media and stuff like that. So it's, again, you're going to hear this over and over again with us today. I think planning is so key in all this.
Yeah, and I think part of the plan too, once you have identified that potentially it's a critical incident where there has been some exposure of data, right? Whether that is highly sensitive information, or in the case of AT&T, right, customer records that are not necessarily tied to a phone number is actually an interesting one, because it might actually not be identified as PII, but unfortunately, because it's so easy to tie somebody's call records to their phone number, to identify that with a person, it's reasonably likely that someone's going to be able to do that. So that's why this particular incident is as critical as it was deemed necessary, because it is really easy to tie call records with a phone number. But so identifying what the level of sensitivity of the data is definitely an important part of this initial step. And then also making sure you're really clear on what are your reporting requirements. How soon do you have to make your customers aware that you've potentially had an incident? Whether or not you're calling it a breach at that point, yes or no, you might not know. A lot of the time, customers might, service providers might call it an event or an incident, because until they've definitively confirmed that somebody had unauthorized access to information that they weren't supposed to, at that point, it raises to the level of a breach. And so they might just, while they're investigating, they don't know, yes or no. And so the first part of it will be just understanding, when does it rise to the level of a breach? And if you've hit that point, right, ideally, you know what your contractual requirements are, how soon your customers require you to notify. You might have one-off customers that you've signed a 24-hour reporting, or there are other ones under HIPAA, you might need to report within 72 hours. Same thing with under GDPR. There's different regulatory requirements that also require incident reporting. And so your legal and compliance team should be really aware of those timelines. And most of those, though, they're favorable in the sense that until it's been confirmed, that's really when the clock runs. But you definitely need to look at the contractual language to understand when does that timing start, because it's usually once the service provider is like pretty reasonably sure that there's been a significant incident. So it might not necessarily be right when they're investigating it, because they still might not totally be sure that there has been, but once they confirm that there has been that unauthorized access, then that's really when the clock normally starts to run. But again, there could be different contractual provisions that I would definitely say your organization needs to be aware of making very clear of what are the incident reporting requirements for your organization.
Yeah, IT people are going to hear something very similar to what they deal with disaster recovery in all this, which is you got to understand what your obligations are. If you have an SLA on a system, you've got to make sure that you can recover that system within that time frame. Same story here with these reporting requirements. You're hearing stories about the timing of things and making sure you understand what the timings have to be, just like we do with recovery time objectives, and making sure that we get things up in a certain way. And so these things are more procedural when we're talking about a breach or a cybersecurity incident than they are, automatable, quite frankly. But we can't automate a lot of these steps because there's the communication channels and bringing things up, but it's going to be much more procedurally heavy than maybe what we're used to with disaster recovery. Though, of course, the disaster recovery stuff could potentially come into play here, so it's not completely segregated. It's a subset of this greater plan here. So yeah, there's a lot to balance at that phase for sure. So you brought up customer reporting, regulatory reporting. I think that's kind of two potentially parallel tracks that an organization could be going to, because depending on those requirements, those SLAs, those contracts, you may be notifying the regulators before the customers, or vice versa, or some mixture of the two. So let's maybe pick up the customer side of things. I guess, Milu, from your experience, how common is it that a company would be dealing with, customer A, we have to notify in 24 hours, and customer B, we have 72 hours, and the rest of the customers have the default agreement, and therefore we've got, a week before we have to notify them, or whatever that might be?
I think it depends on the size of the company. I think smaller, say like startups and leaner organizations, are probably going to have agreed to maybe more custom bespoke contractual terms than say like a really large organization. If you're a really large service provider, most likely, your customers didn't really have the option to negotiate potentially stricter incident reporting timelines. So I would assume a lot of this is going to hinder more on like the size of the actual organization. But again, there are exceptions to every single rule, and depending, you never know what on the sales cycle was really important at the time. And
Yeah.
so I think making sure that the incident report timelines are clear. I would say though, from a customer perspective, if you report to one and another one a week later, you do have the risk, right, that maybe they would have found out in a different way, which might not be the right approach. So that's definitely a risk you would need to weigh. Most likely all of these reports are going to be confidential, and that's definitely something that should be reiterated when you're, having those types of conversations, especially if you're still in the outset of an investigation where you're still not, the company is potentially not 100,000% sure what happened, but they have a pretty good indication of what, potentially went wrong. I think stressing that an organization is still in the middle of an investigation is really important when you're reaching out to customers, and also then really weighing one customer is 24 hours, the other one is 72. How do you weigh that? I think you just really start to just lean into what's the organization's culture. I would say customers are most likely going to prefer that they hear from you more proactively as opposed to after the fact or from somebody else. So I would definitely say this is a really great time to making sure that you're communicating with your customers in a way that they understand, but also potentially understand, especially if you're in the outset of an investigation, of being like, we've had this incident, we're looking into it. You're going to get active communications from us about it, and we're going to try to provide as much information as possible, understanding though that we're still learning as we're investigating and uncovering the details of what actually happened. That's definitely the approach I would recommend, of being proactive and working with your customers and trying to let them know as soon as possible. This is not an area where you should try to like drag your feet. It's better to come forward sooner.
Yeah, let them know there was a situation. You don't have all the details. You don't necessarily have to share all the details, I would assume, at that point, especially if you don't know them. But letting them know that something is happening. They should be watching for updates, because things may move quickly. They may have to react in some way. Hey, we're gonna reset all your passwords. We're gonna force you to start using MFA. Whatever the cleanup needs to be. Those types of things could impact customer operations when you think about like cloud providers and stuff. So those types of things I think are important. I think the industry and maybe the entire culture around the world is at this point is that breaches are common in a lot of ways these days. I'm not gonna try to minimize the impact of all these breaches, because some of them still continue to befuddle the numbers of records and people that are impacted and stuff like that. But it's not really a taboo to announce, hey, we had a breach. Obviously, it's going to put you in a negative light, and to some extent, it probably should, because um, you know security could have been better. Like I'm not going to say anybody's got perfect security, so security could always be better. Did you do enough? Maybe, maybe not. But that's way down the road. That's looking at it after the fact. So yeah, making sure you understand, and again, this is part of the planning aspect. How much are we going to share? When are we going to share it? Who are we going to share it with? All shouldn't be left to figure out after the breach has been found. That is ideally something that will be mostly laid out, and it's a matter of following the steps. The steps shouldn't be hard and fast rules. They should be, leave some room for ambiguity in the moment, but figuring that out. So maybe let's move on to the regulatory aspect of things, and this is a big kind of huge pile of stuff, because you may be having to report to the SEC as a public company. You may have to be reporting to the FCC in a case like AT&T when you're talking about communications. You may be having to talk to Health and Human Services because you've got HIPAA implications. So there may be multiple agencies involved. Obviously, there's an element of criminality to it as well. So FBI, law enforcement are potential places that may get into play here. So Mila, maybe put us in the mindset of a regulator and what their first thoughts are when they hear, "Hey, we got a breach."
Yeah, I think from a organization perspective, you need to be prepared for the harder hitting questions when you're getting ready with reporting to the regulatory authorities, whomever that is, right? You just gave a whole host of different examples, which is absolutely correct. It's all depends on the sensitivity of information and volume also. Potentially, like how many records were impacted might also implicate whether or not you actually have to report it in a certain state, yes or no. But the regulators are going to want to have a more fleshed out, like what actually happened. And so there is something to be said, again, be proactive, right? If you're very clear that there's been a breach and say PHI, like personal health information has been impacted, definitely obviously making sure that you're complying with the HIPAA reporting requirements for the security rule, and are very clear that you're even reporting early if you're not totally sure, again, on the full scope of the breach. But I would say you need to be more prepared for a full understanding of exactly what was the root cause, what has happened, what have you done to fix and test to make sure that the fix is actually like working, and that you're not, potentially continuing to expose information, and that you're working with the regulator and the customers, and that you're preparing to respond and let the consumers know. So I think when you're getting to the point that you've identified that this information is sensitive enough or the breach is large enough that it's going to impact certain law enforcement and regulatory reporting, I would say your instant response and your root cause analysis needs to be like very, probably not buttoned up, but towards the point that you can speak very clearly on exactly what happened, which means, again, you need to be proactive and make sure you meet the timelines, but you also might need to work a little bit longer to actually have that reporting. So again, most likely it's probably going to be internal investigation, customer reporting, and then regulatory reporting in that order. Again, customer and regulatory might be happening at the same time, but most likely you're probably going to have let your customers know that you're investigating something before maybe you've confirmed the final details and you're ready to go report it to the regulators.
Yeah, and like you mentioned before, the AT&T example is an example of where notifying law enforcement actually affected the timeline for everything else, because at that point they discovered, hey, there's apparently national security implications in there. I don't know at this stage if we fully understand what all those are. We may never, because national security. But having those agencies involved, having them a part of the decision making process fairly early, highlights these things and make sure that you as an organization don't get over your skis and do something that you shouldn't in the process, helping to guide you through that. Because AT&T is huge. They've probably got a dedicated security team and dedicated compliance team. They know what they're doing with all of this. They hopefully are running tabletop exercises and have it all pretty well buttoned together. But those of us that work in smaller organizations, those of us that work in highly dynamic organizations, places like hospitals and stuff where they've got staff that rotates around and not everybody knows everybody, that can lend to a more difficult situation. Again, everybody has a part to play. Everybody should know their part in a situation like this, but sometimes having that external perspective can be helpful. A lot of companies do contract ahead of time for, if we have an incident, we are going to call this company and bring them in, and they're going to help us triage. They're going to help us fix. They're going to help us rebuild the dam. They're going to help us investigate. They're going to help us threat hunt. I mean, there's myriad of different things that companies could come in and help do at that point. Again, you got to plan for those. You got to have those contracts in place usually to make sure that they're ready. They're going to want to know what your environment looks like, who your key players are on your side, to pull that all together so that when this happens, you make sure that you're on the right side of all of this, because how you behave in an incident is more telling than anything else. There have been numerous companies that have maybe not gone completely out of business, but have definitely had a major hit to their reputation because of the way they handled these types of breaches.
Yeah, because again, I think for the most part, we've seen the largest success stories of the organizations that are the most proactive about reporting. AT&T is a unique example. They found out about this in April 2024, and then they reported in July of 2024, but the incident happened 2 years ago. So what's interesting about it, right, is the fact that if you think about actually from timeline of identification, investigation, reporting to the public and customers, 2 months is actually, I think, relatively standard in terms of a turnaround time. And obviously that was held up because the FBI was doing further investigations into national security threats. I think the concern would be, for the most part, for most organizations, is how soon are they reporting, and then how soon are they prepared to have that forensic analysis completed, and that they're also ready to actually be sending notifications to consumers, because that's hard for certain organizations. I think that's kind of the next part of it is,
yeah,
there's one thing of your root cause analysis, which is like a confidential matter that you're looking into with regulators and customers. End users, consumers, the story is going to be different because it's going to be more about what options are available to them and actually like how this potential information could potentially be misused. And then generally, I think for most organizations, depending on the severity of information, they might be offering some type of credit monitoring, which I think we can talk about next of what that actually looks like. But, there's really not much they can do. That's, I think, the hard part for a lot of organizations when they do have something like this happen. There's, unfortunately, at that point, once it's out, it's really hard to claw back that data.
Yeah, it's definitely a toothpaste out of the tube analogy situation there. There's definitely people who at this point are like, if everybody has credit monitoring, does anybody have credit monitoring? That seems to be almost a joke at this point, at least in some of my circles, which granted are a certain perspective of this whole situation. We're like, is it doing us any good at this point when all of our information is out there anyway? And, my bank offers it to me. I get it from a credit card. I've got 2 or 3 different credit monitoring that doesn't require my information to be caught up in a breach at this point, because it is just, it's kind of a default operating procedure for modern life in some ways. So at some level, that's not really providing us any recompensation, which is why, of course, you see a lot of legal action against companies in these situations. And in the prep work for this, I'm already noticing that there's work towards having a lawsuit against AT&T for this. And honestly, yeah, sure, they'll get hit. We'll all get a little bit of, we'll all get our $5.21, which that doesn't really make up for anything, because usually those types of things are such a small part of the operating budget for a company the size of AT&T. It's not any big difference to any of us individually. We've got credit monitoring, which is about all we can do. Of course, there are other things that you can do. You can go and you can put a freeze on your credit so nobody can do anything new with it, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, there's once your social security number's out on the dark web, the bad people have it, and they could potentially use it, and it's going to get replicated. And the only thing that prevents it from being known by everybody is the fact that that's a trade of money, and people aren't going to buy your social security number along with millions of others, and then just give them to somebody else. Like they're gonna want to somehow make money off of that. So that's the only saving grace is a little bit of capitalism within the dark web, I guess.
But yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about when we're thinking about what's going to come out of the AT&T breach, again, there's unfortunately for us, if you were impacted, like there's not much that you can do. Again, you can absolutely take up their offer to get additional credit monitoring if that's something that is of value to you that maybe you don't have access to through potentially having credit cards or something like that. You can also, of course, like freeze your credit to making sure that somebody's not taking something out, and then you can turn it back on and off when you need it. But I would also say what's interesting about it is coming through where they're actually thinking the point of exposure, right, was just not enabling two-factor authentication within their Snowflake environment. Also is just a great reminder that if you are a consumer, turning on two-factor authentication can actually protect you in a lot of instances on a lot of your actual systems that you might actually be using to process your information, whether that's, retail, social media, whatever it is that you're using, to potentially protect your information further. Using two-factor authentication, having it turned on everything is better than nothing. I do think it does beg the question of an organization as large as AT&T with the security resources that they have, how did they let that happen? Also, that it begs the question on Snowflake, how are they allowing organizations to not enforce two-factor authentication for their data stores? I think is going to be the other part of, Snowflake was impacted in a breach around a similar time frame, which may have potentially implicated AT&T here, but of coming through with the security provisions not being up to industry standards in this one.
Yeah, and to some extent actually highlights the fact that maybe they have been really good about forcing multi-factor authentication in everywhere, and one person didn't have it for some reason, or one system wasn't forcing it, and that became the entry point. At this point, I don't think we know how exactly they got in. We know the attack vector, but not necessarily how they got in. Smart criminals these days are using the easiest way in and then moving laterally and then getting into the crown jewels, so they're not always hitting it directly. So there's a multitude of ways, and it further highlights the fact that one, you've got to be right 100% of the time, because they only have to be right once, and two, making sure that your partnerships are solid as well. So supply chain type things, which I guess is another venue that we didn't really touch on too much, but follows a lot of the same rules around when do you contact partners, both upstream and downstream, because very few businesses work completely isolated, working with nobody but their customers. So through all of this, generally probably following more the customer path than anything is, when did Snowflake notify AT&T? When did AT&T notify Snowflake? Which direction did that communication happen? And making sure that you've got open lines of communication, you know who to contact there, and ideally working together when something happens that affects both parties, because the more the merrier in these types of situations. Obviously, there's some privacy concerns and trade secrets and all that kind of stuff that you want to keep private. But having multiple eyes looking on these things is generally a good thing, because all you need is one person to spot it and flag it, and all of a sudden you've found something meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, I think the supply chain concern, there's definitely, as a part of this planning exercise that we've been talking about, really, as to what organizations can do when they're preparing ahead of time for a data breach, is thinking through also who are their critical service providers and looking at what are the security configurations, not just who would you reach out to in case something was wrong. That's part of an incident response plan, absolutely. And a disaster recovery plan is understanding who your critical infrastructure points are and what would, the organization do if there was a large outage, but also figuring out, have we looked at all the security configurations and are we positive that our system hardening matches what the best practice is for that particular tooling, and spending time with your security function to making sure that they've looked at the secure configurations and making sure that there really are no exceptions to that, because it is a pretty big gap that they didn't have two-factor authentication turned on. Whether or not that was the reason that the actual breach happened, it's still just a pretty big miss, because that was avoidable.
Yeah, it would have been a miss. Whether it was this time or sometime in the future, it would have been taken advantage of, is really kind of what it comes down to. So
yeah, I think it just begs the question that organizations need to be mindful of. Not only do they have a good plan in place, but also are they working with their partners in a way that they're also meeting the baseline recommendations for that partner standards. So it's not just on the organization to be actively working with those organizations, but also thinking through, have we actually met that provider's best practice recommendations for security, and making sure that that's reviewed on a regular basis, because it could be changing all the time.
Yep. Another thing that should ring true to the IT folks is follow best practices, follow the design guides. We can all probably put these things together and figure them out on our own, but knowing what the best way to configure it, the best way to connect them, obviously every use case is a little bit different. So there are variations that matter within there. But understanding how you should set up a system, how you should connect to two systems, making sure you've got the proper controls in place is critical. And that's something that you should rely on a breach to help point out to you, which is unfortunately the case the way a lot of companies seem to be learning these days.
And part of the lessons learned after the fact, unfortunately. So proactive, take your time, do the tabletop exercises, even if sometimes they feel silly because they are rehearsed, and generally the organization is aware that they're going on. But I will say, doing them often, it's worth having the conversation, because I think every time you'll stand to learn something of oh, we hadn't thought about that, or maybe we should look at this or brush this up, because I would way rather have that conversation ahead of time as opposed to, oh, wouldn't it be great? Hindsight's 2020. We probably should have done this.
Yep. And, updating your plans after a breach is important. Just like, again, it is with the disaster recovery plan, is you test it so that you can improve it. You test it so that everybody knows how to do that motion. Let me drop a book recommendation here. Is Project Zero Trust was a great book that helped me to kind of understand the power of a tabletop exercise and this planning aspect of things, making sure that it put it in a really real world context that helped me to truly kind of grok what that procedure needed to look like, while at the same time learning Zero Trust. So it was kind of dual benefit for me in that regard.
Yeah. Well, I think we've had a great discussion about data breach response and what that looks like for organizations. I'm sure it's something that we'll continue to talk about as we'll continue to see other organizations in the news. But hopefully you weren't impacted. But if you were, again, definitely reach out and look into what the options are available, and take this time to just check into your other systems and making sure you have your own personal security hardened. Do you have two-factor authentication turned on? Are you using authentication tokens? Take this as a reminder to just brush up on your own security practices.
Yep. Always a good idea. Any excuse to do that is a good one. So cool. Well, we appreciate all of you tuning in to listen again this week, and we look forward to socializing with you again in the next episode.
Talk soon.